The golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Oval Office, casting long shadows across the historic desk where the president sat reviewing his daily briefings. It had been a typical Tuesday, filled with the usual mix of national security updates and economic reports, until his secretary knocked on the door with an urgency that immediately caught his attention. "Mr. President, I apologize for the interruption, but there's something you need to see right away," she said, her usually composed voice carrying a note of concern. She held a tablet in her hands, gripping it a bit too tightly. The president gestured for her to come forward, noticing how she hesitated before handing him the device. On the screen was an email from his son's private school, marked Urgent Confidential. His heart skipped a beat as he clicked on the attached video file. The footage was from a security camera in what appeared to be a quiet corner of the school library. The timestamp showed it was from just 2 days ago. At first, the scene seemed ordinary. Students walking past bookshelves, some sitting at tables with their laptops. Then he saw his son, and his blood ran cold. His boy, whom he always seen as a kind-hearted teenager who got good grades and played basketball after school, was standing with a group of students. But this wasn't a friendly gathering. The body language was all wrong. His son was clearly the leader, his stance confident but intimidating, while a smaller student was backed against the wall, clutching his books to his chest like a shield. There was no audio, but the president didn't need sound to understand what was happening. He watched as his son pointed and laughed, the other students following his lead. The victim's face showed a mix of fear and humiliation that made the president's stomach turn. When the cornered student tried to walk away, his son casually stuck out his foot, sending the boy's books scattering across the floor. The president's hands began to shake slightly as he continued watching. This wasn't a one-time thing. The video compilation showed several incidents over the past month. In each clip, his son demonstrated a calculated approach to bullying that was somehow worse than outright physical confrontation. He would orchestrate situations where the victim would be publicly embarrassed, always maintaining just enough distance to avoid obvious blame. Setting down the tablet, the president loosened his tie, feeling like he couldn't quite get enough air. His mind raced back through recent conversations with his son. Just last week, they'd had dinner together, and his boy had enthusiastically shared stories about school projects and basketball practice. How had he missed this? What else had he failed to see? His secretary still stood nearby, waiting for his response. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice rougher than usual. "Cancel my next 2 meetings, and get my wife on the phone." As she left, closing the door quietly behind her, the president stood and walked to the window. Below, tourists snapped photos of the White House, unaware of the personal crisis unfolding within its walls. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just last month, he'd given a speech supporting a national anti-bullying campaign. He'd even shared stories about teaching his own children the importance of kindness and respect. The weight of both his roles, father and president, pressed down on him. This wasn't just about disciplining a teenage son. This was about living up to the values he preached to the nation. The school had done the right thing by bringing this to his attention, but now he had to figure out how to handle it without creating a media circus that would hurt everyone involved. His phone buzzed. His wife was on the line. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the receiver, knowing this conversation would be the first step in what promised to be one of the most challenging situations he faced, not as the president, but as a father. After putting down the phone with his wife, the president canceled all his afternoon meetings. He sat back in his chair, his mind racing with thoughts about his son. The more he thought about it, the more signs he realized he'd missed over the past few months. Opening his laptop, he began digging through his son's social media accounts. The president had always prided himself on staying connected with his kid's online life, but now he saw everything with new eyes. What he'd previously seen as typical teenage posts now revealed a pattern he'd been blind to. His son's Instagram account seemed normal at first: basketball games, school events, family photos. But reading through the comments, he noticed how certain students never appeared in photos anymore. How some kids who used to comment regularly had gone quiet. His son's replies, which he'd once seen as witty, now carried a subtle edge that made him wince. Moving to other platforms, the pattern became clearer. There were inside jokes that felt more like veiled threats. Group chats where certain students were added just to be removed. A modern version of public humiliation. His son was smart about it. Nothing overtly cruel. Nothing that would immediately raise red flags. Just constant, subtle pressure that would make anyone feel like an outsider. The president rubbed his tired eyes, remembering his own school days. He always taught his son to stand up to bullies, never imagining he'd need to teach him not to become one. The memories of his son as a little boy, crying because another kid was mean to his friend at the playground, seemed like they were from a different lifetime. His phone buzzed with text updates about national security meetings and policy briefings, but for once, these seemed less urgent than the crisis unfolding in his own family. He thought about the student in the video, how scared he looked. The president had given speeches about making America safer for everyone, but he couldn't even ensure safety in his son's school. Opening another folder on his laptop, he found photos from just last month. His son volunteering at a food bank, smiling with his basketball team after winning a game. In every picture, he looked like the perfect student, the kind of kid any parent would be proud of. The disconnect between these images and what he'd seen in the security footage made his stomach turn. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His personal assistant brought in a cup of coffee and a concerned look. "Sir, the press secretary needs to know if you'll be keeping your evening appointments." The president shook his head. "Cancel everything. Tell them I'm dealing with a family matter." He knew the speculation this would cause. Any change in the president's schedule sparked dozens of news stories. But right now, he needed time to think. Looking out the window at the setting sun, he realized he'd spent hours going through his son's digital footprint. The sky had turned a deep orange, casting long shadows across the White House lawn. Somewhere in the residence above, his son would be returning from basketball practice, probably checking his phone, maybe even planning his next subtle attack on a classmate. The president stood up, straightening his tie. He'd faced international crises, made decisions that affected millions of lives, but somehow this felt harder. As a president, he could call on advisors, consult experts, look at data. As a father, he had to rely on his heart, and right now, his heart was breaking. Walking toward the residence, he thought about what to say. How do you tell your child that you've discovered their secret life? How do you balance disappointment with the love you never stop feeling? The elevator ride to the family quarters felt longer than usual, each floor bringing him closer to a conversation that would change everything. He had no speech prepared for this, no carefully crafted talking points. For once, he would have to speak purely as a father, not as the President of the United States. And somehow, that felt like the most daunting task he'd faced in years. The walk to his son's room in the White House residence felt endless. The president's footsteps echoed through the historic hallway, each step bringing him closer to a conversation he never thought he'd have to face. He found his son sprawled on his bed, still in his basketball practice clothes, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, can we talk?" the president asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His son looked up, that familiar easy smile on his face, the same smile he'd seen in countless family photos. But now, knowing what he knew, the president wondered how much of that smile was real. "Sure, what's up?" His son sat up, tossing his phone aside. He looked so normal, so much like the kid the president thought he knew. The basketball jersey, the messy hair, the homework spread across his desk. Everything seemed exactly as it should be. "I got an interesting video from your school today," the president said, watching his son's face carefully. For a split second, something flickered in the boy's eyes. Worry? Maybe fear. But it disappeared so quickly that someone else might have missed it. Oh yeah. His son's voice was casual, but his hands had started fidgeting with his bedspread. What kind of video? Instead of answering, the president pulled out his tablet and played the library footage. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. He watched his son's expression change as the video played, from fake confusion to defensive anger to, finally, a flash of shame. That's not what it looks like, his son started, but his voice lacked conviction. We were just joking around. Nobody got hurt. The president felt his throat tighten. Nobody got hurt. I watched that boy's face. I saw how scared he was. How humiliated. You don't think that hurts. You don't understand, his son shot back, standing up now. His dad wrote that article about you last month, the one that said you were weak on foreign policy. He's been bragging about it at school, acting like he knows everything about politics just because his dad's a journalist. The words hit the president like a physical blow. His son had been bullying a kid because of politics. Because of him, the realization made him feel sick. So you thought the solution was to terrorize his son. The president's voice rose slightly. Is that what your mother and I taught you? Is that what you think leadership looks like? Leadership? His son laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. You want to talk about leadership? Do you know what it's like being your son? Everyone watching everything I do, waiting for me to mess up. That kid needed to learn his place. His place? The president stepped closer, his heart pounding. Listen to yourself. You sound like every bully who ever thought power gave them the right to hurt people. I've spent my whole career fighting against that kind of thinking. His son grabbed his phone, his movements angry now. Yeah, well, maybe if you spent less time worrying about your career and more time with your actual family, you'd understand what's really going on in my life. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with hurt and accusation. The president saw tears forming in his son's eyes, despite his attempt to look tough. I'm still your father, he said quietly. And right now, I'm not thinking about my career or the presidency. I'm thinking about my son, who's making choices that go against everything we believe in. Everything we are as a family. Whatever, his son muttered, heading for the door. You don't get it. You never will. He paused in the doorway, his back to his father. And by the way, everyone at school already knows their place. I just help remind them sometimes. With that, he was gone, leaving the president alone in the room. The president sank onto his son's bed, surrounded by the trappings of teenage life, sports posters, school books, family photos. In one picture on the desk, his son was beaming after winning a citizenship award at school. The irony of that image now felt like a punch to the gut. He picked up his phone to call his wife. This was worse than they'd thought. Their son wasn't just bullying. He'd convinced himself he was justified in doing it. And somehow, through all of this, they'd missed the signs that their own child was hurting too. The First Lady's heels clicked rapidly down the White House hallway as she rushed back from her speaking engagement. She'd cut her trip short after her husband's call, knowing that this situation needed her immediate attention. As both a mother and a child psychologist, she knew they were dealing with more than just typical teenage behavior. She found her husband in the family room, his tie loosened, looking more tired than she'd seen him even during international crisis. Tell me everything, she said, sitting beside him on the couch. As he recounted the confrontation with their son, her professional training kicked in, picking up on details her husband might have missed. He said people were waiting for him to mess up, she noted, her mind already analyzing the patterns. And he mentioned you being away a lot. This isn't just about bullying. Our son is struggling with who he is and his place in this world. Standing up, she walked to the window, remembering all the little changes in their son's behavior over the past year. The way he'd stopped joining them for family dinners as often, claiming basketball practice ran late. How he'd grown quieter when they discussed their public appearances. She'd attributed it to normal teenage independence, but now she saw it differently. I should have seen this coming, she said softly. Remember last month when he asked if we could stop having the Secret Service drive him to school? He said it was embarrassing, but I think it was more than that. He's been trying to establish control in his own way. Her husband looked up, understanding dawning on his face. The pressure of being the president's son. We thought we were protecting him, but maybe we've been so focused on his safety that we missed his emotional needs. The First Lady pulled out her laptop, opening files from her years of research on adolescent behavior. Bullying often comes from a place of powerlessness, she explained. It might sound strange, given who his father is, but our son feels powerless in his own life. Every move he makes is watched and judged. He can't just be a normal teenager. She started making notes, drawing from both her professional experience and maternal instinct. He's using his status as your son to gain control, but he's also acting out against it. That student he targeted, it wasn't just about the article his father wrote. Our son chose him because he represents everything our son resents, someone who can speak freely, who can criticize without consequence. The president watched his wife work, grateful for her unique perspective. She'd always been able to see beneath the surface, to understand the deeper currents of human behavior. Now she was using that skill to help their own child. We need to approach this carefully, she continued, her voice both professional and deeply personal. If we just punish him, we'll reinforce his feeling of powerlessness. But we also can't ignore what he's done. He needs to understand the impact of his actions while feeling supported enough to change. She pulled up their son's schedule on her tablet. First, we need to create more private family time. No staff, no security hovering nearby. He needs to feel like he has a space where he can just be himself. Her fingers moved quickly, making adjustments. And I think it's time I started working from home more often. My speaking engagements can wait. Looking at her husband, she saw the worry in his eyes. We haven't failed as parents, she assured him, reaching for his hand. But our son is sending us a message through this behavior. He's telling us he needs help, even if he doesn't know how to ask for it directly. A soft knock interrupted them. Their son's basketball coach calling to check if he'd be at tomorrow's practice. The First Lady caught her husband's eye, and they shared a look of understanding. Every decision they made now would impact not just their son, but the student he bullied, and potentially the entire school community. She picked up her phone to call the school counselor. As both a professional and a mother, she knew the next steps would be crucial. Their son needed to face consequences, but he also needed to heal. And somewhere in this crisis, they had to find a way to help him become not just a better student or the president's son, but a better person. The morning headlines hit like a tsunami. Presidentes SON. CT UMOLY or DVLY. Screamed one newspaper. White House USC HEIR terrorizes classmates, declared another. Somehow, despite their best efforts to handle the situation privately, the story had leaked to the press. The president stood in the Oval Office, watching the news coverage spread across multiple screens. Each channel had their own spin on the story, complete with grainy footage from the school library. His communications team huddled nearby, phones buzzing constantly with media requests. "Sir," his press secretary said, holding up a tablet, "social media is exploding with this. People are sharing old photos of your anti-bullying campaign speeches. The opposition is having a field day." A news anchor's voice filled the room. Sources close to the school claim this wasn't an isolated incident. The president's son allegedly led a systematic campaign of intimidation against several students. This raises serious questions about the administration's stance on bullying. The president's phone buzzed. His wife was calling from their son's school. Their boy had refused to leave the car that morning, seeing the reporters gathered at the gates. Who could blame him? The media crews were circling like sharks, hoping to catch the first glimpse of the presidential bully. "We need to get ahead of this," the communications director insisted. "We should schedule a press conference, show that we're taking this seriously, but also ask for privacy as we deal with a sensitive family matter. But the president barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on a different screen, where a reporter was interviewing the father of the bullied student. The man spoke quietly, his words measured. "My son came home crying multiple times. We had no idea who was behind it until recently. When we found out it was the president's son. Well, how do you even handle something like that?" The interview cut to footage of the president's recent speech at a national education conference. "Every child deserves to feel safe at school," his recorded voice declared. "Bullying has no place in our society." The irony made his chest tight. His phone buzzed again, this time with messages from political allies. They were all asking the same thing. How are you going to handle this? The president's anti-bullying initiative had been a cornerstone of his domestic policy. Now it looked like he couldn't even prevent bullying in his own family. Social media was even worse. People were sharing old photos of his son at charity events, questioning whether it had all been for show. Memes were already circulating, comparing the president's public statements about kindness with his son's actions. Some defended them, saying kids will be kids, but others called for the son's expulsion from school. The school principal had emailed, requesting an urgent meeting with both parents. Other parents were demanding action, worried about their own children. The president's son's basketball teammates were being hounded for interviews, asked to share stories about their captain's behavior. His wife sent a text. "He's finally in class." Security had to clear a back entrance. "He looks terrible." Attached was a photo of their son, his usual confidence replaced by a haunted look as he huddled in his seat, trying to ignore the whispers and stares of his classmates. The president sank into his chair, the weight of both public and private responsibility crushing down. Every parent dealt with their children's mistakes, but not every parent had to do it under the glaring spotlight of international media. How could he guide his son through this when the whole world was watching, judging, waiting to see what they would do? A new alert popped up. Someone had leaked more videos. The story wasn't going away. If anything, it was growing bigger by the minute. His political opponents were already calling this a reflection of his leadership, suggesting that his family's private failings reflected public policy failures. "Mr. President," his chief of staff said gently, "we need to make a decision. How do you want to handle this?" Looking at the chaos unfolding across every screen, the president realized they'd reached a turning point. They could try to minimize this, treat it as a private family matter, or they could do something unprecedented. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this crisis into an opportunity, not just for his family, but for every family dealing with bullying. He picked up his phone to call his wife. Before they made any public statements, they needed to talk to their son. Whatever they decided to do next would affect not just their family's future, but potentially change how the nation discussed bullying and privilege. The president's son sat in the school counselor's office, staring at his shoes. The room felt smaller than usual, probably because both his parents were there too, along with the principal and the family of the student he bullied. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I know this is difficult," the counselor began, her voice gentle but firm. "But sometimes the hardest conversations are the most important ones." She looked around the room, making eye contact with everyone present. Today isn't about punishment. It's about understanding and healing. The bullied student sat across from the president's son, his parents protectively close. He looked different now, not like the scared kid from the video, but someone who had found his courage. His father, the journalist who had written the critical article, kept his hand on his son's shoulder. The president's son shifted in his chair, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations. His mother had helped him prepare for this moment, but all the practiced words seemed to stick in his throat. Finally, he looked up, meeting the other boy's eyes for the first time. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I've been thinking a lot about what I did. Not just what's in the videos, but everything. The comments, the jokes, getting others to ignore you." He paused, struggling to find the right words. I kept telling myself it wasn't that bad, that you could handle it. But that was just an excuse. The room fell silent, waiting. The other student's face remained neutral, but his hands were clenched tight in his lap. The truth is, the president's son continued, his voice growing stronger. I was angry. Not at you, really. At everything. At being watched all the time, at having to be perfect. He glanced at his father. When your dad wrote that article, I used it as an excuse. But that's all it was, an excuse to feel powerful when I was feeling powerless. The other boy's father leaned forward. Do you understand what your actions did to my son? He stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria. His grades dropped. He wanted to quit the debate team, something he loved, because you were there. The president's son felt tears burning in his eyes. I didn't know. I knew, but I didn't want to know. It was easier to pretend it wasn't real. He turned to the other boy. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I understand now. What I did was wrong. Really wrong. Something shifted in the room. The other student unclenched his hands, sitting up straighter. You know what the worst part was? He said quietly. I used to look up to you. Before all this started, I thought you were cool. You were good at sports, smart in class, and nice to everyone. I didn't understand what changed. The president's son felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The other boy continued, when you started picking on me, others followed. Not because they wanted to, but because they were afraid you'd turn on them next. Is that the kind of power you wanted? The words hung in the air. The president squeezed his wife's hand, watching their son face the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just about two boys anymore. It was about the ripple effects of choices and the true meaning of leadership. No, the president's son whispered. That's not what I wanted at all. He straightened in his chair. I want to make this right. Not just with you, but with everyone. I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. The counselor nodded approvingly. That's a good start. And I think I have an idea about how we can turn this situation into something positive for the whole school. As she outlined her plan, involving both boys working together on an anti-bullying initiative, the tension in the room began to ease. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. A chance to transform a story of bullying into one of redemption and growth. The president watched his son's face as he listened to the counselor's suggestions, seeing something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Maybe this crisis, as painful as it was, would help his son find his way back to the person he was meant to be. The lights in the White House press room were blindingly bright. Camera crews adjusted their equipment as journalists whispered among themselves, wondering why the president had called for this unusual evening address. The room fell silent as the president walked in, but instead of heading to the podium alone, his son walked beside him. The boy looked different from his usual polished self. His school uniform was neat, but his face showed the strain of sleepless nights. Still, he walked with determination, even as cameras clicked rapidly around him. The First Lady sat in the front row, her presence providing silent support. Good evening, the president began, his voice steady. I stand before you today, not just as your president, but as a father. My son has something he wants to share with the nation. He stepped back, letting his son take the podium. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. He pulled out a piece of paper, then pushed it aside. I wrote a speech, he said, his voice shaking at first but growing stronger. But I think it's better if I just speak from my heart. Looking directly into the cameras, he continued, most of you have probably seen the videos by now. You've seen me bullying another student. You've heard the stories. They're all true. A murmur ran through the press corps. This level of honesty from a political family was unprecedented. I could make excuses, say I was stressed, or that I felt pressure being the president's son. But the truth is simpler and harder to admit. I was wrong. I hurt people because I could. I used my position, my father's position, to make myself feel powerful by making others feel small. His voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. To everyone I bullied, I'm sorry. To their families, I'm sorry. To my parents, who taught me better, I'm sorry. And to everyone who believed in me, I'm sorry I let you down. The president stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. As a father, my first instinct was to protect my son from this publicity. But as a leader, I know we have an opportunity here. An opportunity to show that nobody is above accountability, not even my family. Together, they announced a new initiative: Privilege and Power, recognizing responsibility. The program would start at his son's school, but would eventually roll out nationwide. It would focus on how people in positions of privilege often misuse their power and how to change that pattern. I'll be working with the student I bullied, the president's son announced, his voice stronger now. He's agreed to help develop this program. Together, we'll share our story with other schools. Not because it's a nice ending, but because it's a new beginning. Journalists' hands shot up, questions flying from all directions. But the most powerful moment came when a reporter asked, "Why come forward publicly? Why not handle this privately?" The boy paused, looking at his father before answering. Because hiding it would mean I was still bullying, just in a different way. Using my power to avoid consequences instead of facing them. That's not who I want to be anymore. The First Lady wiped a tear from her eye as she watched her son stand tall, facing the world's judgment with newfound courage. The cameras caught this moment too, not just a political scene, but a family facing their challenges together. As the president wrapped up the press conference, his son added one final comment. "I know some people will say this is just for show, that we're doing this to save face. All I can say is, watch what we do next. Judge us by our actions, not our words." The press room erupted with more questions, but the family left together, united. Outside, the sun was setting over the White House lawn, casting long shadows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had taken the first step toward turning a painful truth into a moment of real change. This wasn't just damage control or a political move. It was a family choosing to face their mistakes publicly, hoping their honesty might help others find the courage to change too. 3 months had passed since the press conference, and the school hallways felt different now. The president's son walked beside his former victim, carrying posters for their latest anti-bullying workshop. Other students no longer parted ways when they passed. Instead, they often stopped to chat or ask about the next meeting. "I still can't believe how many people showed up last time," the former victim said, taping a poster to the wall. Even the seniors are getting involved now. He'd grown more confident over the past months, finding his voice as a leader in their initiative. The president's son nodded, remembering how nervous they'd both been at their first workshop. "Remember when we could barely look at each other? Now we're teaching other kids about bullying." He laughed softly. Life's weird sometimes. Their program had started small, just the two of them sharing their story with younger students. But it had grown into something bigger. They'd created a mentoring system where older students looked out for younger ones. The basketball team, once known for its cliques, now made sure everyone felt welcome at games. The school counselor watched from her office as the two boys worked together. She'd seen many anti-bullying programs come and go, but this was different. The students weren't just listening to adults talk. They were learning from their peers, seeing real change happen. During lunch, the cafeteria had transformed too. The invisible boundaries that used to separate different groups had slowly disappeared. The president's son no longer sat just with his sports teammates. Instead, their table had become a mix of students from all different circles. "Hey," a freshman approached their table nervously. "I heard you guys help kids who are having trouble with bullies." The two boys exchanged glances, remembering their own story. "Pull up a chair," the president's son said warmly. "We've got time to talk." The freshman's relief was visible as he sat down. This was what real leadership felt like, not controlling others, but helping them feel safe and heard. After school, they headed to their weekly meeting with the principal. The walls of her office were covered with charts tracking the program's progress. Reported bullying incidents had dropped by 60%. More importantly, students were stepping up to stop bullying when they saw it happening. The other schools in the district want to start similar programs, the principal announced. They've asked if you two would help train their student leaders. She smiled at their surprised faces. Your story is making waves beyond our walls. That evening, as the president's son rode home in his Secret Service vehicle, he pulled out his phone to read some of the messages they'd received. Students from other schools wrote about their own experiences with bullying, either as victims or bullies themselves. Each story reminded him of how far he'd come. At home, his parents noticed the change in him too. He was more present at family dinners, more open about his feelings. The weight of pretending to be perfect had lifted, replaced by the genuine desire to be better. His father found him in the family room, working on plans for their next workshop. How was school today? The president asked, sitting beside him. Good, he replied, then paused. Actually, really good. A kid came to us for help today. Last year, I would have been the one he was afraid of. Now, he smiled, now I get to be part of the solution. The First Lady joined them, carrying evening tea. I heard from the school board today, she said. They want to make your program part of the standard curriculum. Your story could help thousands of students. The president's son thought about the boy he'd been just a few months ago, so focused on power and control. That version of himself felt like a stranger now. He picked up his phone again, reading the latest message from a student asking for advice. You know what's funny? He said to his parents. I used to think being strong meant making others feel weak. Now I know it's the opposite. Real strength is helping others find their own strength. Outside the White House windows, the sun was setting on another day of change, not just for one family or one school, but for an entire community learning a better way forward. 1 year had passed since the viral video that changed everything. The president stood at the podium in the school auditorium, looking out at a sea of faces from schools across the country. This wasn't a political event. It was the first national conference of the Privilege and Power Initiative, led entirely by students. His son stood at the back of the stage, no longer the nervous teenager from last year's press conference. Now a senior, he'd grown into a true leader, but not the kind who needed to push others down to stand tall. Beside him was his former victim, now his closest friend and partner in their anti-bullying work. When this journey began, the president began, it started with a father's worst moment. Discovering his child had hurt others. But what happened next showed me something remarkable about young people. When given the chance to make things right, they often exceed our highest expectations. The screen behind him showed photos from the past year. Students working together in workshops, mentoring sessions between older and younger kids, community events where former bullies and victims shared their stories. Each image told a story of transformation. In the front row, the First Lady watched proudly as their son stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, eager to hear from the young man whose story had sparked a movement. A year ago, I stood before cameras and admitted I was a bully, he began. That was just the first step. The harder part was facing myself every day and choosing to be different. But I wasn't alone. He gestured to his friend. The person I hurt the most became the person who helped me change the most. Together, they presented the results of their program's first year. Bullying incidents had dropped in every school that adopted their approach. But more importantly, they shared stories of real change. The football captain who now ate lunch with the computer club, the popular girls who started a homework help program, the former bullies who became peer counselors. We learned something powerful, the former victim added. Bullying isn't just about mean kids being mean. It's about power, how we get it, how we use it, and how we can share it to make everyone stronger. A student from another school raised her hand during the Q&A. Weren't you worried about ruining your reputation by admitting what you did? She asked the president's son. He smiled thoughtfully. My reputation was already ruined by doing what I did. Admitting it was the first step to building a better one. Not a perfect reputation, a real one. After the conference, families lingered in the hallways, sharing stories and exchanging contact information. The president watched as his son moved through the crowd, stopping to talk with everyone who approached him. There was no trace left of the angry young man who'd once used his power to intimidate others. Back at the White House that evening, the family sat in a private residence, looking through messages from students around the country. Schools in other nations had started reaching out too, wanting to implement similar programs. Did you ever think, the First Lady asked, that our biggest crisis would turn into our proudest moment? The president looked at his son, who was drafting ideas for next year's program. Sometimes our worst mistakes lead us to our best opportunities, he replied. The trick is being brave enough to face those mistakes head-on. His son looked up from his notebook. You know what's really amazing? The kids who used to be scared of me now come to me for help. And every time I help someone, it heals something in me too. As the evening wound down, the president received news that their initiative would receive national funding, allowing it to reach every public school in the country. But watching his son laugh with his former victim as they planned their next workshop, he knew the real success wasn't in the numbers or government support. The real victory was in the simple truth that one boy's journey from bully to leader had sparked a movement of young people choosing kindness over power, understanding over intimidation, and courage over fear. In the end, it wasn't just about stopping bullying. It was about teaching the next generation a better way to lead.